republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oyez, 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 all persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. Every school morning in the Elk Grove Unified School District's public schools, government agents, teachers, funded with tax dollars, have their students stand up, including my daughter, face the flag of the United States of America, place their hands over their hearts, and affirm that ours is a nation under some particular religious entity. I am an atheist. I don't believe in God. And every school morning, my child is asked to stand up, face that flag, put her hand over her heart, and say that her father is wrong.
The First Amendment has only 16 words about religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These were the first words of the Bill of Rights. For former colonies created by religious refugees who had fled European countries in search of religious freedom, James Madison and the founders considered religious liberty an essential building block to establishing a free society. Madison adapted the language from the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedoms, written by Thomas Jefferson, which guaranteed that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion.
But the fact is that we started our country with a commitment to protect certain fundamental rights, and the framers assumed that they were given to us by birthright. So they're not up for a vote. These fundamental rights, including religious liberty, our framers believed, are given to us by birthright, and the state does not give them. The state may not take them away. They are something we recognize that all human beings have as a natural right.
I think the Constitution is an amazing instrument that has preserved our freedoms. And these are 55 guys who locked themselves in a building for 89 days and just argued and discussed and debated a way to come up with a great government. And they looked at all the colonial governments, they looked at governments throughout the world, they looked through history, and they said, you know, what are some good ways to protect the people? And what they saw constantly, and what we see today, I mean, look around the globe, is that religion causes problems when it gets intertwined with government, that when those two things become associated with one another, bad things happen to people.
It's the first liberty because without freedom of conscience or freedom of the mind, there are no other freedoms. So logically and philosophically, freedom of conscience is prior to free speech and free press, assembly, and petition, and make them all possible.
And the founders were concerned with state churches. They didn't want a Church of England or a Church of the United States. So they put in an establishment clause. But by that, they didn't mean you could not have government acknowledgement. In fact, that first Congress put in place chaplains, authorized missionaries to the Indians in the various territories of the United States. But generally, when you talk about the free exercise of religion, what you're saying is, how does someone practice their religion? It's not what you believe, because you can hold any beliefs you want in America. It's how you practice that belief, and the court protects those to a limited extent, but it does protect them.
There's a real tension between the idea of the free exercise of religion and not establishing religion, because any time that you give a special break or preference to one religious group in order for it to practice its religious faith, in some ways you may be encouraging people to join that religion and get that break. So there's a lot of tension between the idea of free practice of religion, free exercise of religion, and not promoting it using the power or the resources of government.
So you have a situation where, for instance, the Declaration of Independence, which has a specific reference to being endowed by a creator with these inalienable rights, and then talks about relying upon divine providence. There are some that believe that even reciting those in a classroom in a public school could be problematic, constitutionally difficult. Others say, no, this is who we are, this is the founding documents of the country, and we should allow it. So there's always tension in these documents.
I think that the metaphor, a wall of separation, has often been misused and misunderstood. Jefferson certainly never intended for any kind of separation under the First Amendment to mean hostility to religion. In other words, the First Amendment may separate church from state, but it doesn't separate religion from politics or public life in America. Neither Jefferson, Madison, or any of the other framers, I think, envisioned a nation where religion had no role in our public life. In fact, religion has played a role in American history, in all social movements in American history, in all public policy in American history, from our founding to the present day. But Jefferson and Madison particularly were concerned to make sure that we protected the conscience of every citizen by keeping the government out of religion.
The idea of separation of church and state was an idea that goes back to 1644, when Roger Williams in Rhode Island spoke about separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the wild. It was used repeatedly by all of the framers, by Thomas Jefferson, by James Madison. So yes, the clause, those words are not there. That concept is clearly there.
In 1801, the Danbury Baptist Association wrote a letter of grievance to then-President Jefferson, stating that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals. Their state of Connecticut was one of the few that still had a state-funded or established Anglican church.
Jefferson wrote a letter in response to a letter he received from the Danbury Baptist Association in Danbury, Connecticut. And he wrote in that letter that he preserved and believed in, with high authority, the separation of church and state. But you have to look at what he was referring to. He did not want the government, this is what he was concerned with, interfering with the internal affairs of religious organizations, churches in particular, and thought you needed to keep this separation. He never said, I want to take out references to God or religious heritage of the country out of American public life.
He never anticipated that the two entities would never talk to each other, but he certainly felt that religion in America needed to make it or break it on its own without government help.
I think there's no question that religion has done very well under our arrangement. We are now the most religiously diverse nation in the world. And among developed nations, as compared, for example, to Western Europe, we're the most religious nation. Why? Well, part of the reason has to be the First Amendment arrangement. This extraordinary experiment in allowing for people to freely choose in matters of faith without any government interference. This extraordinary arrangement that says that government has no business involving itself in religion.
In the first 150 years, the First Amendment did not apply to the states. The issue of religion in public life was a state and local matter. It wasn't until the 1940s that the Supreme Court incorporated the free exercise and establishment clauses, thereby mandating that the states abide by the First Amendment. In the early 1960s, the Supreme Court rules that prayer written by the government or school officials is not constitutional under the First Amendment.
Well, certainly vocal prayer that's in any way sponsored by government at events like high school graduation, sporting events, or the homeroom period at the beginning of the day is constitutionally forbidden. Individual students, of course, have never been told they can't pray together or in groups as long as they're not in any way disruptive of the rest of what's going on in the school classroom. As far as moments of silence, courts are still split on that question, but if it's clear that the purpose of a moment of silence is to get children to pray, that's constitutionally forbidden.
Well, the Pledge of Allegiance has been with us a long time as a patriotic exercise in the United States, and it dates all the way back to the late 19th century when Francis Bellamy, a minister and a socialist, wrote the pledge, and later it was picked up by a number of patriotic organizations in the United States and thought this would be a great way to honor our flag for Flag Day. And then others thought, well, this would be a great way to really bring to public school students the importance of our flag and our nation. So Under God wasn't added to the Pledge of Allegiance until 1954. And again, we're in a time of crisis in America. It's a time when many people are frightened about the threat of communism throughout the world.
It all began one Sunday in 1954. That old Pledge of Allegiance, it needed something more. Though it seemed to be working for 60-something years. The nation had McCarthy, the nation had great fears. The politicians sensed it. Hey, how could they refuse? They had those Pledge of Allegiance, need some old religion blues.
Several civic groups called for the addition of Under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. Congress decided, at this moment of our history, the inclusion of God in our pledge, therefore, would further acknowledge the dependence of our people and our government upon the moral directions of the Creator. At the same time, it would serve to deny the atheistic and materialistic concepts of communism.
Congress, by adding the words Under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, turned an affirmation of patriotism into a kind of religious loyalty oath that now is expected to be said by children and young people all over this country.
They were trying to draw a distinction in 1954 between the United States and how we viewed rights and liberties and the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union believed that any rights and liberties, if any, derived strictly from the state, and the state was free to take them away. And the United States was drawing that distinction. We were at the heat of the Cold War.
I think all this stuff is wrong. You know, in God we trust as our motto, in God we trust on our coins and currency. The Supreme Court starts off its sessions, God save the United States and its honorable court. Every legislative session in Congress starts off with prayers to God, paid for with tax dollars. You know, the president takes his oath, so help me God, and every political speech, God bless America. I mean, all of that stuff, as far as I'm concerned, is wrong.
Michael Newdow sued Elk Grove County in California for violating the First Amendment by requiring that his daughter's class had to say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning.
You're taking small children in the public school setting, led by their teacher, in a group session where they have this coercive pressure to do what, you know, all their friends are going to do. It's hard to stand up and, especially in young kids, they always want to be accepted by their friends. And you're saying, put your hand on your heart, stand up, face the flag of the United States and say, we are a nation, essentially, that believes in God. There's nothing even close to that.
Newdow's case moved up through the court system all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
And in a surprising decision, I say surprising because courts have generally dismissed these challenges as not rising to the level of establishment. So it was surprising that a panel of the Ninth Circuit in a 2-1 decision decided, in fact, that he was right, that doesn't define our country, particularly when you look at a public school setting, where again, the courts have generally been stricter about applying the Establishment Clause because you have a captive audience and you have impressionable young people.
Like most Americans, I was shocked and personally offended by the court's decision on the Pledge of Allegiance. The pledge is a powerful expression of American patriotism. This decision was wrong-headed, and it should not be allowed to stand. Today, the state of California is going to take decisive action to overturn this decision.
The under God is really just an acknowledgement of what our founding generation believed. Our founding fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence this idea that rights, liberties, and freedoms don't derive from the government, because if they just derive from the government, the king, and that's what they were worried about, the King of England, could take them away. But rather they believed what John Locke had been saying, and that there are certain rights and liberties and freedoms that are so inalienable that their source has to be the creator of the universe, and that means only he could take them away. And that really reflects almost an Enlightenment philosophy at the time, but it really reflects the founding generation.
Well, those who think Mr. Newdow is mistaken, of course, argue that references to God in something like the Pledge of Allegiance or On Our Money are just acknowledgments of a history, a tradition, a way of speaking about our country. They don't rise to the level of religious practice like a prayer. Therefore, they really don't harm anyone deeply. They just refer to how we've often in our country talked about our nation. They refer to kind of a long history of looking at our country through the lens of being a nation under God. Sometimes justices in the past, when they have mentioned these references to God in our various documents and in our government, they've talked about that as mere ceremonial deism. They've kind of dismissed it as simply just part of the fabric of who we are. It's a way of speaking. And that it really, these references have been drained of religious meaning because they now are just part of these ceremonies and rituals that no longer have a religious intent or content.
They've expressed the view it's just a ceremonial matter. Do you think the pledge has the same meaning today as when it was enacted, when the words under God were inserted into the pledge?
It's an important question because the reference to under God in the pledge, as numerous decisions of this court have indicated, it is an acknowledgement of the religious basis of the framers of the Constitution who believed not only that the right to revolt, but that the right to vest power in the people to create a government came as a result of religious principles. In that sense, the Pledge of Allegiance is today that has that same significance to this country as it did in 1954 when it was amended.
The inclusion of God in the pledge, therefore, would further acknowledge the dependence of our people and our government upon the moral directions of the Creator. And we'll note it wasn't a creator, it was the Creator, the Christian Creator, and we know that because when they put the flag up the flagpole, they played Onward Christian Soldiers Marching as to War. I mean, this is clearly, we know what was going on here. It was to get religion in our government, and the outcry that came when the Ninth Circuit issued its opinion shows that people still want their religious beliefs in our government.
The nation was startled by the Ninth Circuit ruling regarding the Pledge of Allegiance. Many people protested the decision. Michael Newdow even received death threats.
Michael, what in the hell is wrong with you, you dumb son of a... I said, you're a dead man walking, man. Somebody's going to kill you. Not me, but somebody will. I said, you're treading on thin ice, pal. You better change your damn view.
In Congress, members demonstrated their support for under God in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I don't know that the Pledge of Allegiance is a prayer, but I do know that the words under God have one kind of significance only, and that is religious significance. What could it possibly mean if it wasn't religious? So when some of the folks who criticized people like me for making a big deal out of this said, well, under God really, it's not that important, or it doesn't have anything but a secular significance. I say to them, it's a pretty bad day for religion when the words under God lose their religious significance, and in this case, they certainly did not. So although not technically a prayer, The Pledge of Allegiance is an affirmation of religious belief, and that has no place in a public school.
Well, the court has adopted a doctrine back almost 20 years ago called Ceremonial Deism. And there's some within the religious community that don't like that phrase. Although personally, and I consider myself within that religious community, I have no problem with it. Ceremonial Deism means that there are certain ceremonies, like God Save the United States in this honorable court, like our national motto, In God We Trust, that are part of the fabric of America, this kind of an understanding of who we are as a people, what our founding generation believed rights and liberties came from.
And that's why 99 senators in the Congress got out on the steps of Congress. I don't think there's ever been a time they've ever done that before in protest, as they did, to stop what they were doing, to tell everybody how much they wanted God and government because it's ceremonial and it doesn't count.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
That's why it was on the front pages of every newspaper, because it doesn't count. That's why we have all these people going crazy because it's just ceremonial and it doesn't count. Okay. Isn't there something in the Ten Commandments that shall not bear false witness? This isn't ceremonial. This is because people want God and their government. They want their religious views, and that's exactly what they're forbidden from having by the Establishment Clause.
What Justice O'Connor said most recently in one of the famous Supreme Court cases was that she used these words. She said, "It would be ironic indeed if a nation founded by religious refugees would sever the ties that bind it to that religion even today." And there she was talking about the ceremonial recognition of belief in God as part of our American experience.
You know, the very fact that there was such a tremendous battle over whether or not under God should be in the Pledge of Allegiance demonstrates how powerful those two words are. They're certainly not merely ceremonial, they're not meaningless, they mean a lot, and that's precisely why they're so controversial.
And the child doesn't have to say those words.
But the government is not allowed to take a position on that. Government is saying there's a God. Certainly the child doesn't have to affirm that belief if there weren't the coercion that we see in
Child doesn't have to if it doesn't want to. That's not an issue in this case.
The issue is whether or not government can put that idea in her mind.
In 1943, in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the Supreme Court ruled that students could not be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance against their will. Justice Jackson wrote, "To believe that patriotism will not flourish if patriotic ceremonies are voluntary and spontaneous instead of a compulsory routine is to make an unflattering estimate of the appeal of our institutions to free minds." With that decision, the court allowed students to opt out of reciting the pledge.
Of course, nobody's forced or compelled to say the pledge. There are students that opt out of saying the pledge every day in public schools across the country without any difficulty.
But there's tremendous social pressure, particularly on elementary school children, to go along with what the authority figure, the teacher, is telling you is the appropriate thing to do. It takes a pretty tough fourth grader to stand up every day, leave the room, and face the ridicule of her peers, or worse, because she appears to be different. I don't think young people ought to be put through that on a daily basis in America's public schools.
Under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, from Mr. Newdow's point of view, and those that object to the under God and the pledge, it doesn't cure the problem to allow an opt-out. Just like they would compare it to a school prayer question. If, in fact, it is government endorsement or establishment of religion for teachers to lead kids in prayer, then it doesn't matter if no one opts out. Conscience is violated, religious liberty is violated by the state taking sides in religion, by the state endorsing religion. That's just on its face, and they would say, a violation of religious liberty.
The state of California requires those patriotic exercises in that school district under the phrase patriotic responsibilities of the schools, or words to that effect, and the school district itself puts this in the category of a patriotic exercise. And to go back to what this court has taught us with respect to the Establishment Clause and the endorsement prong of the Establishment Clause, it's the entire context. It's the nation's history, it's a pledge of allegiance to the flag and to the nation for which it stands, and then a descriptive phrase, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
It's not a prayer, It's in a ceremonial context, and it has a long history of being evoked for civic purposes. Of course, some people will be offended, but those people who are offended can in fact ask the child, where they have custody, to be excused or not to say the words "under God." So it's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it serves a purpose of unification at the price of offending a small number of people like you. So tell me from ground one why the country cannot do that.
Well, first of all, for 62 years, this pledge did serve the purpose of unification, and it did do it perfectly. It didn't include some religious dogma, but again, the principle is the same. We are separating our people. We don't need to. Again, the Pledge of Allegiance did absolutely fine and got us through 2 world wars, got us through the Depression, got us through everything without God. And Congress stuck God in there for that particular reason.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You know, unfortunately, some religious groups are looking for power, and they're looking for, if you will, a government blessing of their position. And they go and seek that because they are unwilling or unable to believe that they can voluntarily persuade people to come to their viewpoint. It's very dangerous, though, for religion to use government to promote its viewpoint, because the next day, the next week, the next year, some other religion might have power, and they might be very disturbed when government would embrace that alternate religious viewpoint. Religious people ought to understand that the free exercise of religion and the principle that government won't promote religion both strongly protect the integrity of the church, the synagogue, the temple, and the mosque. It's the greatest idea, separation of church and state, that this country has contributed to the history of thinking around the world, and I think we tinker with it at our peril.
For Establishment Clause does not prohibit civic and ceremonial acknowledgments of the indisputable historical fact of the religious heritage that caused the framers of our Constitution and the signers of the Declaration of Independence to say that they had the right to revolt and start a new country, because although the king was infallible, they believed that God gave them the right to declare their independence when the king has not been living up to the unalienable principles given to them by God.
Thank you, General Olson.
You know, we don't allow heckler vetoes in the United States. I mean, the price of freedom in America is if you hear something you don't like or might see something you don't like, look the other way or don't listen. But you don't have the right to censor somebody else. And I think the danger of what some have advocated is, legally speaking, basically a heckler's veto, a right to censor. And we don't deputize private citizens to silence others.
I'm hoping the court will uphold this principle so that we can finally go back and have every American want to stand up, face the flag, place their hand over their heart, and pledge to one nation, indivisible, not divided by religion, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Newdow.
While we would have preferred that the Supreme Court had ruled on the merits of the issue and settled it once and for all for our nation, we are pleased that we can continue reciting the pledge each and every day in our schools.
The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 on an issue of standing to overturn the Ninth Circuit's decision on the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Newdow has submitted similar cases in hopes of restoring the pledge to its original form.
If the decision had not been reversed, the Ninth Circuit's ruling would have stood, and 9 or 10 million students in the western United States would have been banned from saying the pledge with the words "under God."
I think when we fight about questions like under God and the pledge, it's not really about under God and the pledge. It's really a struggle to define our nation, to think about who we are. And for many Americans, to say that we are a nation under God is deeply important because they see that as core to the American experiment in liberty. And they see that as consistent with our founding vision. There are many other Americans who may even share some of that belief, but think that a core principle of our founding is to make sure that no one is made to feel as though they're an outsider in their country. So that even if they believe our nation, our liberties are derived from God, they don't believe the government has any business imposing that on people. So even if the under God stays in the pledge, or if under God is removed from the pledge, I think the deeper question is, how can we maintain an arrangement in this country where religious liberty is protected for every single person, for people of all faiths and for people of no faith at all?